Welcome to Pixel Chasing, the podcast where we talk to fascinating people about the most exciting and disruptive trends affecting our world today. With a focus on innovation, science and technology, we engage with the trailblazers and influencers who are taking an active role in shaping our future and signposting the current winds of change. So whether you're walking the dog, looking for some background content for your workout, or are simply looking to learn from experts in their fields, there'll be something for you on Pixel Chasing. Welcome to Pixel Chasing. I am your host Michael Marciano, and today's guest is Dave Cairns, an office leasing broker at CBRE who focuses on the flex and co-working sector. Dave has embraced the opportunities of distributed working in a post-COVID world, having moved last year from Toronto to Prince Edward Island in Canada. He is proving that with modern tools and technology, we have more options for how we wish to live than ever before. In a past life, Dave was a professional poker player, which has informed what some have called his somewhat iconoclastic take on the real estate market and the broader future of work conversation. Dave is also an avid explorer of new technologies and ways of gathering. In 2023, he co-founded a conversation series called Inspired People, Inspired Places, which seeks to explore the future of the human experience, where participants and speakers meet inside a virtual world to wrestle with important topics. This was another great conversation with someone who shared a lot about their past and how that has directly influenced their vision of the future around work and living and ultimately real estate too. I hope you enjoy listening to this as much as we enjoyed recording it. Happy listening. Right, we made it. After toing and throwing and back and forth. I guess that's what you get when you try and pin down a man who is nomadic by nature and design these days. So colour me surprised, but you're here. Where are you actually? You actually look. People can't see this, but you look like you could be anywhere. A very indescript room. There's a window. There's no signs of anything. Where are you?
Wow. I mean, my room, I'm actually in my bedroom at a cottage on the north shore of Prince Edward Island that my wife and I purchased as an investment property. But this is past even the shoulder season, because here in this part of the world we've got the winter, and while I actually am in awe of the winter on the north shore of this island, it's not high tourist season. So right now we're here for the weekend. My daughter's got a few days off of school from parent-teacher interviews, and so literally behind me is one of the more beautiful views I think in the world. And I guess in theory I'm part of a I'm here in the future, from the future of work, aka the future of living.
Well, that's probably a good segue or starting point. Like, who are you? Who are you, and why did you appear in my life around 2020 on my screens, on my feeds? Why not beforehand? And is that telling of something? So, like, who are you?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm glad you asked it so open-ended. I mean, just first on the why did I appear in your feed? I mean, I think a lot of us started to appear in each other's feeds in 2020. I think it was like the pandemic was one of the most like sticky connected moments at the beginning for the world, like where we previously weren't really spending too much time trying to get to know people from around the world, and we're really more focused on our like sort of local geographies. All of a sudden the world became our collective oyster, and I think that ignited a greater interest in producing content for a greater number of people. Now, I was one of those people who was already producing content on really, I guess, the future of the office landscape at the time, which has become more broad for me now. But I think I took the opportunity to dive into it a little bit deeper, in part actually just because I had fuck all else to do. I'm an office leasing agent. There was not a lot of office leasing to really be doing. And it kind of felt like the definition of insanity to me to prospect companies about office space at a time that I felt would be perceived as very insensitive. I think in the UK where you come from, you call them like estates agents or something. I'm one of those, or surveyor. I don't know which one
Surveyors.
I am.
Yeah, you go.
Yeah. So
An
yeah.
agent.
So
An agent.
look, some of the nicest and smartest and most humble people I've ever met are brokers or estates agents, but let's call a spade a spade. A lot of them are really insufferable. And I don't think a lot of people like receiving an inbound from a broker in the best of times, let alone in the worst of times. So I opted for just deciding to lean into more to content than into prospecting. So I just want to set the stage there because I think that we all appeared in each other's feeds all of a sudden, and there was a greater impetus to create, which I think is so cool. And anyway, to go back in time, I'm originally from Toronto, Ontario, and I think what frames me in the context of my professional life well is that starting with being a ski racer. So when I grew up, I was a competitive ski racer.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
cool.
I'm gonna take a sip of coffee here.
What age
Yeah,
does one
and
need to start? Were you naturally very, very talented, or did you like work super hard to become like that level, or a bit of both?
well, I never got to like the highest levels of skiing or anything. It's a really, really difficult competitive sport, and it costs a lot of money, which is one of the other barriers. My dad actually was a competitive water skier and competed. He was one of the best. He was the best in the country at a time, and for whatever reason, he transitioned from water skiing to snow skiing. So it was really not my decision. He chose a life where we were going to ski. Um, but I took to it, and I think in my high school days, one of the things I really liked about it was this sort of black and white pursuit. You start at the top of the hill, you go down, your time is your time, right? Like there is no ambiguity there around who wins or who loses or who comes second, or who comes third, or who comes 50th. And there was just a purity of that I liked. And I also liked the fact that you would train with your team and try to help each other rise up, but then you would compete against each other on the day, right? Because it's an individual competition, it's not a team sport.
Oh, are there
Um,
some parallels to brokering in terms of having to work with a larger, wider corporate, but also, you eat what you kill? Is there some parallels there?
well, there actually is less on the client side and more to do with other brokers, right? Like you compete against each other, and then you also have to collaborate as well. But before I get there, what ended up happening around 18 was I just kind of made the decision I wasn't good enough to continue to pursue this sport. Weird, just a quick anecdote on it. When you get to be 15 years old as a ski racer, all of a sudden you're competing in an open competition and age is no longer a factor, which is crazy when you think about it, to put 15-year-olds in a race where there could be like a 30-year-old. Very, very different physiological stages of life, which is what makes it crazy because you're trying to continue to get a better score each race, which helps you start earlier in the race at the next one. But it's just like, I don't know, you're chasing your own tail for a while, and it's really steep competition once you get to about 15. So anyway, I opted to get out of it.
Oh,
But
tough,
I
tough,
had
tough decision.
yeah, I think I felt a bit of a void because I really liked this individual competition. But it just didn't feel right to continue. Um, but anyway, at that time, it kind of coincided with this strange circumstance for me, at least, where it was around 2003, and this guy named Chris Moneymaker won the World Series of Poker, and uh, he was an accountant from Nashville, Tennessee, who had actually qualified for the tournament for $30 on PokerStars.com. And this is in the early days of online poker. It had actually been around since the early 90s, but it was starting to actually become popular enough that people like accountants from Nashville, Tennessee were playing. Anyway, he parlays $30 into 2.5 million and a win. He wins the World Series main event, which started this boom in poker, which I then got involved in. And at first, I was just organizing home games with my friends, and I'd be the guy organizing the games. And eventually, people stopped caring about it, but I still really liked it. And that kind of was timely with me going to university. And I ended up kind of filling the void of competitive ski racing with the poker, really. And so in university, I spent a lot more time playing cards than I did studying. I was fortunate enough to end up graduating college, but in that time, I ended up by the time I got to fourth year university, most of my success came near the end of university, which thank God, because I probably would have dropped out sooner, like some of my other poker friends did, who experienced success earlier on. But I had won a tournament for around $270,000,
Oh my God.
and notably, like a lot of people were in the tournament. It was like I think it was like 7 or 8 thousand players, and I won the event. It started at 9 o'clock at night, and it finished at like 8 in the morning. So I played like all night and won this tournament.
What was it? What was
And
the like? What was your heart doing like the minute before you won? Like, did it come down to like a turn of a card, or was it less suspenseful than that?
oh no, it did. Well, I think we actually got all in pre-flop. So like all 5 cards ran out and you're just watching it run out. And I actually remember I punched my friend in the chest.
Listen, we do things in the moment. But
Yeah.
also, if you win a quarter
Uh,
million dollars, I think you can do what you want, really, going towards that.
yeah. Yeah. So on that note, what was sort of weird for me at the time was all my friends were graduating, feeling this sort of existential dread of like getting a job and who do I work for and whatever. And I didn't have that at all. From A, I had money, and B, I was obsessed with the game. So like I kind of actually, when I look back, I had more certainty around my life at that time than I've ever had since. And frankly, right now I'm in a period of uncertainty career-wise that I haven't experienced before. Anyway, I ended up starting to play at a higher level poker wise with my own bankroll, and I quickly realized how volatile this game was. I thought I was good, but I got a rude awakening, like when you start to actually play for real, not just as a serious hobby, but as a like this is what I want to make my profession, and you try to like go up the games and play with better players. I started to realize I was not very good at the game. So kind of a lucky and stressful place to be because most people don't have meteoric success in anything. And the people that I knew in poker were, had grinded their bankrolls incrementally up, where I kind of had a couple of big wins, which made me feel that I was basically better than I was. So I realized how quickly I could go broke, and I opted to take a little bit of time off from playing the game after going down to Vegas and playing a few of the World Series of Poker events, and just seeing how quickly, like if you play an event for 5 grand or 10 grand, like if your bankroll's like 300,000, like watch it turn into
Yeah.
dust fast, right?
Was anyone around
Uh,
you saying, "Hey, slow down. You're young. Like, think about career-wise," or people like, "This guy's brilliant. Just go for it. Don't stop."
I had more trouble with like my family and stuff when I was actually in university than worried I wouldn't finish. I think the fact that I had finished, like people were kind of
Was
leaving
the
me
win?
alone.
What was your
It was
degree in, by the way?
political science and marketing, so it was very general. The only word I remember from my political science degree is the word blitzkrieg. That's all I have.
It's 4 years well
Well,
spent.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, whatever, we all know, you grow. You if you're fortunate enough to have that opportunity, it's more
100%.
growing as a person than anything else. But yeah, so I ended up playing the game. I took a break, like I said, and I said to myself, if I'm going to do this, I need to find a way to do it sustainably. And so, in a period where I was traveling with a friend of mine, I said, if I really feel the urge to do this seriously, it'll come to me. I'll find a way to not do it in a volatile way. So after like 3 months of not playing at all, I found myself in Australia going to internet cafes
So,
and being like,
how does one find themselves in Australia? You didn't sort of just stumble on a 24-hour flight somewhere. Although, I don't know, how far is
no,
Australia
no.
from Canada?
Oh, it's far,
Okay.
very far. But no, I'd been traveling for several months with a friend of mine through Europe and Southeast Asia and then Australia. But by the end, like for a while, I was traveling with my friend, we were partying, and then by the end, I was finding myself in internet cafes more than I was like going and doing day trips with him or whatever. And that's kind of funny to even think back to internet cafes, right? Like
Mm,
that's
it
not
was a
really a
thing.
thing anymore. Yeah, it was a thing. I actually kind of missed that. I liked it, like being
I
able
think it's
to.
better for our mental health. Having to make a decision to go online rather than being a default reaction is a healthier place to be.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, it's almost like co-working too, right? Like it's kind of fun. Like you go to an internet cafe, it's like co-working. You're just sitting there,
it's an
and
intention.
I never thought about this, but there's like a social contract there that isn't present in a lot of office environments, right? Which is like people are there to do their thing, and you kind of you have a little bit more respect not to interrupt people. But
100%.
yeah, so anyway, I never thought of that, but I really enjoyed it. So I found myself in these internet cafes, and this is back when Facebook was really one of the only places to connect with people. And I knew one guy from college who was a serious poker player. He was the only person I knew that was serious about the game. And I just reached out to him on Facebook. I said, "Hey, I'm serious about pursuing poker. Like, do you know anybody who can invest in me? I'm looking for a backer." And he connected me with this guy in Vancouver. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it because it's a long story, but he ended up saying to me, if you want to come out to Vancouver, there's a big poker tournament going on. I'll actually buy you into the tournament and we can connect and see if there's something here that's worth exploring. So anyway, I went out there. I actually bought myself into the event and just I could afford it, and I wanted him to know that I was serious about it. And long story short, it was a 4-day tournament with like 900 players in it. So like it takes that long to win it, because in person it just takes way longer than
And
playing
one
online.
winner from that 900 down to one, or the
Yeah. There's a price. They pay about 10% of the field, and then first was like 330 grand. Anyway, he makes the money. We end up playing with each other actually at one point throughout the event. Like we just landed at the same table, which is kind of like random, unlikely for that to happen. But we play, and then he makes it into the money, but he busts on the third day. I made it to the fourth day, and actually ended up coming 10th in the tournament
wow.
for like 25 grand or something. It was literally the worst $25,000 I've ever won in my life because it's just so dejecting to like, you can
To
literally
come
see
to
there
come
are
10th.
9 people between you and winning the event, which honestly is even worth more energetically than the money. But still, the spread between first and 10th was $305,000. Like it's a huge difference, right? So anyway, I I ended up going back to Toronto having not even spoken to this guy. And I'd send him a message on Facebook being like, "Hey, we never even spoke about the deal or like a backing deal." And he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna back you. I'm gonna give you an offer tonight." And I'll never forget that. It was like I felt like I'd won the lottery because I think getting a real job felt like life or death to me. And
Hmm.
this meant that I could sustain playing the game without going broke. Like, whether I was going to win or lose, I just knew now I could put a lot of my own money to the side and someone else could back me, and I could play for a while and see what happened.
And
Um,
they back you and they take a cut on the upside. That's it.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about other things, so we won't, let's not go down a rabbit hole on the whole way the poker industry works. But I did that for this is in 2009. So I ended up going to play or going to work at CBRE in December of 2012. So it was sort of like roughly 4 years that I competed at a high level in poker. At one point, I was ranked one of the top 100 online tournament players in the world.
Wow.
Um, Now I took the backer because I wanted to try and win a huge amount of money in a live tournament. The biggest prize pools were live. Um, and funny enough, just as a quick an aside, people are worried about remote work like killing the real estate industry. It's really just going to fundamentally change it, just like poker did. Online poker grew live poker exponentially. The amount
Hmm.
of live poker stops that were created as a result of the online poker economy was exponential. Like if you look at the amount of money that was earnable through playing in-person poker prior to the internet, it's now dwarfed because of the internet, right? So I think it's important for people to realize that it's just that a lot of the time incumbent players are not the ones that win, right? Like new poker brands were created from online poker that started to do better than a lot of casinos were able to do, doing it the old school way. So there's some similarities to the evolution of things there. But anyway, I did it for, yeah, like I said, about 4 years. Took the backer because I wanted to try and hit a big score. I never did hit the live score. So I mean, one of my bigger like pains in retrospect is like, I think I've played like 25 or 30 $10,000 buy-in tournaments in person. I've never cashed a 10K buy-in. So I've literally lost like 250 or 300,000 just in 10K buy-ins alone. So a lot of the profit I was making online I was actually paying my backer with that money for the money that I was losing in person. The volatility between online and in person is huge. It's like higher buy-ins live, less volume, and then online is lower buy-ins, higher volume, right? So they're inversely correlated. And to actualize your ROI in live poker can take a decade. But some people, just like I had a big score online that maybe I didn't deserve, same thing in live, right? Some people just hit it in their first year on the circuit and make 1 million or make 2 million. And you know, you're like, wow. So I never did it that way. But in 2011, I sort of started to transition out of poker. The DOJ in the United States indicted the two largest online poker websites for tax evasion, money laundering, wire fraud, all these charges, and consequently made it illegal for anyone in the United States to play online poker, which just materially impacted the games for the worse. The games became smaller and more competitive because the biggest market was the US, just like in every other domain of the world, right? So I just kind of took it as a nod from the universe to stop playing, or at least transition out. I spent a lot of time partying for a while because I actually had money. That was the interesting thing. I didn't go broke, even though like I had a lot of my own money. Some of the games I was playing, I was actually able to play without my backer. He didn't want all of my action.
Mm.
Um, so I had some ability to make money throughout those 4 years that I didn't have to deal with him on. And then I also had my nest egg from having made money prior to getting the
Actually,
backer. So I had money, which was a bit of a blessing and a curse because I didn't need to get a job. So I sort of fumbled around for a while. And in fumbling around, people who cared about me were like, you need to stop fumbling around. And so I decided to get into real estate, a bit of a leap of faith. I had friends and family in the industry, and people encouraged me to do brokerage. They're like, you're good with people, you've got analytical skills, and you're used to not making a salary, which in North
mm,
America, brokers don't make any form of salary. I
call
understand in
commission.
Europe, yeah, I understand in Europe, it's like
You have a
salary
base
bonus.
plus, yeah.
Yeah, so in North America, that's not the case. So it's not really for everybody, right? But for me, I was like, I go home neutral. I don't lose money. Like, okay, I can do that. That sounds better than poker to me. So I got into the industry. Maybe I'll pause, take a sip of coffee, see where you want to go from here.
It's it just prior to you going more into some of the details of how skiing or poker works. I was trying to. It felt sort of antithetical to me, someone of that character and background, going into what is a fairly stale and unexciting industry. But you can draw parallels there. You can draw parallels in terms of what you're saying. But what I'm trying to understand is, so I spent time as a broker, and I felt it fundamentally unfulfilling, and not in line with things that particularly interested me. And like you, I sort of fell into it in a way. Again, people saying, people, buildings are quite cool. You should go into that. Was it that? Is it that there are elements that are similar for you, or actually it's not, and we're just trying to create a link that isn't there, and it was just a sort of pivot in life into a new direction.
Yeah, well, I want to get to like how my brain changed when the pandemic happened, because I sort of like connected to people that I didn't realize I was. But truthfully, like a lot, like the decision to get into the industry was really just partly due to being in a period of stagnation in my life and needing something to sort of like kickstart me in a new direction. And I'm not too dissimilarly in a similar spot now, except I got all kinds of fucking mortgages and a child and a partner, and like it feels way more daunting than it did back then. But of course, it's always easy to say in the rearview mirror that things don't feel daunting. I'm sure when I was 25, this felt very daunting to me, figuring out what to do with my career. But no, I was really just like the thing that I liked about brokerage was like there was a lot of upside potential. Although I always found it laughable that people told me it was like uncapped. I'm like, well, it's not uncapped. The real estate market in Toronto is a certain size.
The ceiling.
I'm only one person. There's clearly a ceiling. So don't tell me it's like uncapped. It just felt like, I don't know, it feels like you're selling someone like a snaky story, which brokers are like that. But anyway, it was really just more of a like I like the upside potential. I felt that once I figured out how the industry works and I could actually be a 100% commission broker, I'd control my time, hopefully, which was something that I valued, right? I didn't want someone telling me like where to be or how to work. So those actually were the initial things I think that I found appealing more than anything. Truthfully, I didn't really give a fuck about real estate. Like, like right? Like it was just like, can I make money? Can I own my own time? That was basically it. Yeah, so anyway, I did it for 8.5 or 9 years, the traditional way, going to the office every day, selling the office, blah, blah, blah. Um,
But then
I
were
guess
you suited and booted? You weren't.
oh yeah,
You
oh
were
yeah.
corporatized, correct?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. But I had various like stages. That like if one of my friends, his name is Brian Porter, if he like if I shared this with him, he'd be laughing his ass off because like at first I was too intimidated to try to be my own version of anything, right? I just like wore the suit, blah blah blah. Then I went in this phase of like I went into my honeymoon in Southeast Asia and I bought like all these cheap suits that were like cooler, and started wearing sneakers and suits. And then like, like I wasn't wearing a tie. And then like all of a sudden a bunch of other people weren't wearing a tie. And then then I started making more money and I bought like nice suits, ties and everything. And then finally, once I had really like felt like no one could tell me what to do, I started to reject the suit culture altogether. And I was like, I don't want anything to do with this. And that definitely created some tension because brokerage houses are very suited and booted, even still to this day. Some of them almost seem to have like doubled down on it harder after the pandemic.
But
um,
you earned that right to be different, basically. So you proved your worth and value to give you that ability to be distinguished
yeah,
from your
yeah.
colleagues.
Yeah, now I should call out the fact that like there's definitely some white male privilege even just built into that in and of itself, right? Like to even have the ability to earn the right is a privilege that most people don't even have. So I think it's worth calling that out. But yes, generally speaking, yes. Um, but I also just sort of like started to incrementally look at doing business in this industry different. Like when I got in late 2012, social media platforms were really starting to take off, right? And what I found is that the advice I was getting from brokers that were seasoned, like go into a cold calling room, pull up an Excel sheet of the stacking plan of the building, look for the email of the CEO and fucking type an email to them, or call them at this one was even more, this was like the definition of the patriarchy. They're like, go into the room at 7 a.m. and call these guys before their actual workday starts, which wasn't even a thing anymore because people were starting to work from anywhere, right? Like the
Mm,
technology decoupled that whole like sit at the desk at 7 a.m. Although obviously there are still
still
a lot
some.
of men out there who like to go in at 7 and not be a dad, not be a partner, not be any of those things and just like escape into their little world. But it was just like the advice was stale. It wasn't working. And so I did actually end up incrementally moving into content creation. I even created a marketing platform called CBRE Forward, which was designed to showcase the success stories of Canada's innovation ecosystem. And I thought like maybe that's a cool way to actually build a brand with the tech sector of Canada, which is and still is growing fast. And I was just trying to find ways to not be a salesperson and try to more be a member of the community that I was trying to serve, basically. So anyway, that was sort of like generally the evolution of how I prospected for business and did business. Then the pandemic happened, and I went, wait a tick, I've actually been here before. I have collaborated, connected, and worked almost entirely remotely or digital by default, which was unique in my industry because most hadn't, right? And so I ended up going down this path of reigniting this guy that I had locked the door on and or like closed door, locked the key, this digitally native guy, right? Because in poker, when I started playing poker, we didn't call it remote work or we didn't call it anything. Like we were
It
just
just was.
doing, yeah, we were just playing poker. Like, and we played in person too, right? And like, for the same reasons that it doesn't make sense to go to the office every day, it didn't make sense to drive to a casino every day,
Mm,
right? Like there had to be like, generally speaking, when you're playing poker, unless you just wanted the change of scenery or there was a good game that you knew about, you'd rather play online. And then you'd travel to these live poker stops where there were many tournaments going on, lots of cash games going on, that you knew that if you were going to expend that energy, that cost, whatever, that it was definitely going to be worth it, right?
Seeing some
Um,
parallels coming out here now.
yeah, exactly, right. But we just didn't define it as anything. But I think that that made me feel a level of comfort with remote work that certainly the industry didn't and doesn't have. And for me as a person, it started to get me to really deeply analyze like what life do I want to build going forward, because it's clearly not going back to the 9 to 5 existence that I had been part of on autopilot basically since I started in real estate in late 2012.
See, very interesting background.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
and towards the end, I mean, maybe not quite on the same level as when Steve Jobs sort of reflects back on his career, and he sort of joins the dots as to when he went to sort of calligraphy classes, and that gave him the idea for fonts for when he was at Apple. There's clearly some dots that get joined now when you sort of pause and look back, and whether it's the nature of how you when you're skiing or the competitiveness and the hybrid nature of working with poker, it all culminates to where we are today.
Hmm. Well, actually, now it's just like where I am today, right? In 2021, my wife and I, so in Ontario, it's particular Toronto, Ontario, had some of the worst pandemic lockdowns in the world. Like we were more locked down, like in terms of like where you could go and for how long than most places in the world. And I think that that had its own unique impact on everybody. In fact, my wife Amanda just mentioned to me yesterday that Toronto is apparently the most unhappy city in the world right now. Or I don't know if it's in the world or in Canada. So I don't want to, at least in Canada, it is the most unhappy city. And I can't sit here and recite all the data behind that, but intuitively it kind of makes sense. It's all in a lot of ways it's a bit of a miserable city already, but I think the pandemic lockdowns have had a residual impact that's still trailing in that city. And for us, we really experienced the gravity of that. We have some personal life circumstances related to our daughter and her health that made the lockdowns even worse. And so for us, it just had us starting to really question like, what life are we living here? Like, is this working? And we elected to just be truthful to each other and say like, this is not working. And so we started down a path of saying like, we need to get out of this city. Where we go, I don't know, but we know we need to get out of here. At one point, I was going to explore. I was exploring a job in San Francisco, which didn't pan out. And then once that didn't pan out, my wife sort of like came back to me and she's like, "Look, like we've been like PEI, Prince Edward Island, is this place that we love. We actually were trying to buy oceanfront property out here with the hope of being able to spend summers here and be here as much as we could." Um, and she's like, why wouldn't we live there? Like, your career's in flux, the world's changed. Like, why wouldn't we live there? But for me, it was like a huge identity crisis, right? Because it's still, even to this day, a lot of the work that I do is in Toronto, and so I'm working in the office, excuse me, in the office market, not exclusively remotely, but remotely. And I had to like really step outside my like the ego that I had and that I think a lot of the industry has. And I got practical and I was like, okay, how much of my job can and actually is done remotely? And I arrived at the fact that a lot of it actually is done remotely. It's just that I was doing it from an office.
Mm.
Like I spent a lot of time on the phone with people, communicating over email. Like I don't know what the actual thresholds are, but it's in the ballpark of like 80-90% of the actual job is on the phone or this, right? So effectively it can be done from anywhere, which is crazy when you think about it, because I'm a real estate agent currently and I'm able to do most of my job remotely. Now, again, to level set and be self-aware, I don't believe that it would have been as easy for me to do that at all starting my career
Mm.
fully remotely. But because I'd actually reached, like a level of success already and had a network and everything, it did make it easier. So I ended up having to be the one to like let go of a lot of my own assumptions, like let go of my ego and lean into this decision that my wife was encouraging us to make. And it's been a crazy ride ever since. I love this place. I'm very happy to not live in Toronto anymore. Not all aspects of having made this decision are easy at all. And while I haven't had to definitively decide what to do next, it is fast tracking that decision for me. And and again, when you make a decision to leave a large city, you do close the door on certain opportunities. But at the same time, I think once you kind of get into the middle and the later stages of your career, I mean, I don't know that location and work are as dependent as they end up being in the earlier stages of one's career. So even people that are living in a large city are actually conducting a lot of remote work for their profession, right? Like, and they're having to travel sometimes, et cetera. So I don't necessarily think that me being here closes as many doors as maybe my brain is even telling me right now. Like I'm almost doing my own psychiatric assessment as we're talking right now.
Just
Um,
lay down, get on
yeah.
the couch.
Um, but no, I mean, like, so I joked at the beginning, like I'm coming to you from the future of work. Like I'm not the first person to decide to live on Prince Edward Island and work remotely. But I think the difference now is that there's a more it's a more democratic opportunity for more people. It's available to more people than it ever has been to decide where you want to live. And I think for me, I don't believe it's just an acceleration. Like I think most of what's happened with this pandemic is an acceleration or a compression of existing trends. But at the same time, I do ask myself, like, was I just going to end up in PEI 10 years later? I don't know. Like, I mean, maybe I would have ended up somewhere else. Like, I think that there's a bit of an inflection point to this pandemic that caused some things to happen that may not have happened at all.
So how then do you consider the reality is that there are no absolutes here. It's about being flexible and making decisions that recognize that. When you're out in your quote unquote day job, how do you reconcile the not being there part when you're trading physical assets? Is there an inherent contradiction, dichotomy in that, or is that part of what you do? Is you explain that physical assets have a purpose of a certain value of a time and a place, but I say that being X number of miles away on an island, and to what extent have the landlords or the tenants you work with on either side, how have they adjusted to that reality a few years on from where we were pre-pandemic?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that definitively changed for me by making this decision, and that was by design. I'm not working with a company that needs 2,000 square feet of office space anymore that might need to tour a space on a moment's notice, right? I've spent more time actually working with some of my either larger clients who are actually like a lot of the work is multi-market work anyway, right? Where they have needs in Chicago, Atlanta, Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, whatever. I have a few of those types of clients where, again, it's more account management work, which is more of a remote
Mm-hmm.
job anyway. And sometimes you need to travel related to that type of work. And then in addition to that, I've been working with the flex sector, not actually helping those operators fill up their spaces, but more so trying to help them add locations. So Convene, by example, is one of my clients, and those types of assignments are ones where sometimes I have to go back to a city like Toronto to do a tour or whatever, but then you end up going back into remote work
Mm.
negotiations, right? So I did say goodbye to a part of my career that was more high volume, and so there actually is more volatility in my career today than there ever has been as a broker. But in part, that's actually something that the whole industry is experiencing as well. So I'm not, while I think that my own choices have actually caused my life more stress, everyone is more stressed right now because demand for office space is materially down. Um, so like that's how my job has changed. And while it's still working for me, it's to the same thing that you said earlier, like, being a broker just didn't really get you wanting to jump out of bed. I'm starting to feel that same thing too. Like and actually I was feeling that before the pandemic. So, but life's complicated. It's not easy to just like, you know, transition out of things sometimes. Um, and I at the same time, like I still get a lot of freedom from this job too. So, but I am actively looking at what I can do
One of the
next
things
in my
I
career.
saw you get involved in, and again, this had its own uh, peak and bubble, and then reset into reality, is around the Web3 space, around VR. What's your
Hmm.
what's your take on that? So, just there was a clearly uh, buoyed by remote, buoyed by the pandemic and being remote. Uh, Meta changing its name, Harbour coming out, people needing to connect in different ways. We saw a mass adoption of these services, and there's one. I remember there's this one online events platform that was once valued at several billion during the pandemic, and it was sold off recently for a few, I think maybe 10 million. So we know
Yeah.
value has changed. What's your take on the VR market and how that interconnects with workspaces? I know you spent time doing sessions
Hmm.
in that world, and
Hmm.
as a tap onto that, wherever your answer is going to be, to what extent does Apple change that dynamic next year?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think I should make the disclaimer that I am in no way an expert on Web3 or
Very few
metaverse.
people are. That's the beauty.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, a friend of mine named Harman van Sprang, who is this incredible guy working with the Shared Cities Alliance out of Amsterdam, and he's always quick to say we're all explorers. Where Web3 is like exploring new lands. No one actually is an expert. So yeah, I actually look at myself as someone who's more being a practitioner in a virtual world. What I've been doing is a friend of mine and I, Chris Moeller and myself, have created a roundtable conversation series called Inspired People, Inspired Places that we've elected to do inside of a virtual world. So our partner is actually Verbella, which is yeah, they're a virtual world software company. And we specifically use what's called their open campus, where it's a place that anybody can go to. It's not a private space that like PwC would buy on a license agreement and own and operate themselves. Anyone can go in. Me and you could go in there right now. Um, so we've made a partnership with them that makes sense for both of us, where we bring activity to that space and they're allowing us to use it. And we really, Chris and I were not trying to get too invested one way or another on the future of like XR, right? Like sort of the more broader, like not just virtual reality, but augmented and mixed reality. We weren't really laser focused on that. We just thought to ourselves, could conducting conversations in a virtual world earn people's attention better? Because right now, everything feels kind of stale. Like whether it's a Zoom webinar or even going to the office, like there's just like it'd be interesting to see how people might respond to using a new modality, and maybe we might earn their attention better. And like there's a lot of friction to entering a virtual world, right? Like most people only have a work laptop. And so if you want to download that software client, Verbella's software client, you got to get permission from your employer, right? Then you got to make an avatar. Then you have to like commute to a co-working space in a virtual world, right? And you may not even know how to get there. Luckily, we have community managers that actually spend time in these in this open campus that can like help you get there. But like there's so much of this friction that it to me it almost feels like it's like a virtual dive bar. You're like trying to stumble your way into something cool, right?
Mm.
And so I'm not really very fixated on how well or not well this stuff is doing. And then the other aspect of it is we were wondering, can we create an environment where everybody feels more comfortable to have meaningful conversation? And that term is generally referred to as psychological safety, but I think that word's becoming a bit of a hot button or almost annoying. So I don't really like it. The bottom line is like, can we create an environment where no matter whether you're neurodiverse, whether you don't feel comfortable on camera or not, whether you're introverted, extroverted, a place where maybe power dynamics can flatten and hierarchies can flatten, like, can we just create an environment where people might feel more comfortable to have deep conversation? And so that was sort of like the foundation of why we decided to do this and explore what was possible there. And then we just wanted to talk about interesting stuff, right? Future of work, future of education, community, well-being, regenerative technology. We just wanted to bring in interesting people and gather. So far, it's been really interesting. We've done it now 16 times. We're looking at doing it in seasons of 10. And I guess what I'm thinking this thing is becoming is we're almost like a virtual events company. But we're going a little bit further than the average event does in the sense that we are actually sourcing speakers and facilitating the conversations. In addition to providing the technology, the space, and the hospitality, we're actually running the events on behalf of whoever wants to show up. So I don't really know where it's going to go. It's really just more of a passion exploration thing. But there's a few things that we've found since starting it. For one, like, we are finding that we're getting people's attention better. Like,
In the
just that
room
we're
or to come to the room.
in the room. Like, we're finding that the level of engagement, and we're witnessing this simply by when we get to question and answer period in these roundtable discussions, people are really like bringing it, and like so are the speakers, right? Um, that level of engagement is actually better than I've experienced in a lot of other modalities, whether they be webinars or in person. I've actually found, as the person who's moderating the conversations, that there's this like creative freedom that can come from not even being like this, where it's allowed me to explore and go deeper and get more vulnerable depending on the topic than I would have actually even thought. And I'm actually now also getting the same back from the speakers, which is really interesting. And I was talking to one of the speakers that came on. I won't mention their name, but I was saying to her, I think that you went as deep as you did because your brain didn't even think that this was a real conversation.
100%.
And she was like, "Oh my God, I never thought of it that way." And she's like, "Yeah, I think you're right." Because she really gave me something. I'm like, I don't know if you would have given that in person. I don't
If
know
you
if
were
you would
sitting
have
in a
given that on
room
Zoom.
face to face, the body language
Yeah.
would have shown up, you would have felt uncomfortable, you would have felt that anxiety, but the screens create that distance, which
Yeah.
has a lot of pros, but also I found, I think, in the workplace, you alluded to it around balancing out power. And one you always think about, if you were a pre-COVID, if you're an entrepreneur trying to raise some cash, getting on the train, going to a big building, sitting in the office foyer, being called in, going to a big boardroom, that's intimidating. And sitting behind a big table with five big guys, that's all gone now. So that way it's great, it flattens it. So actually being on a Zoom call with you, and I can see you're a real person, you live in a normal house, there's a kid screaming. It takes away a lot of that tension and fear that might have existed previously in the real world. But conversely, also I find, to a degree, it also diminishes some of those necessary social constructs that have been built up for good reason.
Hmm.
Sometimes how we turn up in a call, things that we say more flippantly, the way we chat now through either through Zoom or even through a Teams channel, like suddenly everything's a lot more blurred, which on one hand creates far more familiarity in a good way, but also can create too much familiarity in a bad way. And I think in a workplace, those lines can become a bit blurred. But to your point, it does create a far more fluid conversation where people's sense of uh, fear of sharing is definitely diminished.
Yeah. So I like that you've let's talk about some of the nuance for a second of like what either needs to become better or different, or how we mix these two or three or four different ways of interacting. Um, Before I get into some of the things that I think are different about virtual world interactions or avatar to avatar interactions instead of what we're doing right now, I will say that the technology clearly has a ways to go. Like, like for example, like in these worlds, like, everybody's eyes blink at the same rate. Your mouths don't move. You can't pick up on some of the cues that I actually still can pick up on through this screen,
Mm.
in terms of like How are you experiencing this conversation that we're having? So clearly that's a drawback. But on the flip side, some of the things that we found to be really interesting about avatar to avatar is that there's elements that are actually closer to in person than what we are doing right now. So I'll give you an example. When we first started conducting these conversations, we left the doors to the virtual room that we were having them in open. And what we found is that people would just go and sit down. And what that was doing, and we didn't, it took us a while to figure it out. It was reducing the opportunity for engagement between people before the conversation actually started. And so what we decided to do is just close the doors and force people to congregate in the foyer
Mm.
in front of the space that we do it in. And all of a sudden, people who had met each other at previous sessions were talking, new people coming in were walking into walls, someone was catching them and telling them what was going on, and friendships were either getting stronger or forming, and people were talking. That is a dynamic that you cannot experience in a Zoom call, right?
True.
Even awkward things like trying to shake hands, with each other in avatar to avatar. I think I don't, I'm not, I don't have any data to back this up, and I'm not an expert in this area, but like my intuition tells me that parts of our brain get activated doing stuff like that are not possible through what we're doing right now. We had another person named Rowena Hennigan, one of our speakers. You can actually stand up on the table in this world, and she was like, "Oh my God, I've never been able to do this. I'm going to stand on the boardroom table." It was basically like her "fu" to the patriarchy, which I thought was really cool, right? So there's those elements that I think are different and better. So now to go to your Apple and their augmented reality glasses. I really believe that that type of technology is going to be very transformative for the simple reason that I think it's going to create the ability for people to move between uh, their actual physical environment, an augmented version of that, and virtual reality with a lot more ease. And so, like, no one can know, but will we get to the point where like the glasses are like the ones that you're wearing right now, and you're going to walk down the street and you're going to see mixed reality. You're going to see holograms as well as your actual environment, hopefully with the ability for you to decide how that works, and hopefully with an understanding of how that will either positively or negatively affect your mental health. So there's a lot of unknowns. Um, but if I just look at how technology's evolved, I'm optimistic that the size and of these pieces of equipment that need to go on our head will hopefully become like less like cumbersome over time. And that future to me feels like one where someone can literally just, instead of having to like use their desktop computer, download Verbella's software client, sit like this in front of it, they might be able to go pop into one of our sessions, at the office, for example, on their lunch break in a meditation room or something like that, with a lot less friction and more ease. And like, it's not a binary thing, right? Like, I'm not sitting here saying like everyone should just dive into being in a virtual world and that's it. Like, we all know that that makes no sense. But like, I like to think tangentially, because if we can, in a more immersive way, connect with each other virtually, it really opens up a lot more opportunity for people to be in person for moments that matter to them, either in their professional or personal lives on their own terms, versus the need for proximity to move the ball forward, so to speak, in our professional lives, which has historically been really important, right? Like, you've needed to do that. Hey, baby.
Hi.
Yeah, my daughter's just coming in, I think, to say hi. Um,
Is she feeling better, by
yeah,
the way?
what's that?
Is she feeling better?
Yeah, she's feeling better.
Good.
But no, I think that I'm really, really optimistic about where this technology goes. Yeah, she came in. It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry. No, no, don't worry about it. It's fine.
See, there was a
Yeah,
time pre all this where people you've seen the amazing BBC interview with a guy, is talking, and then his one kid runs in, then the second and the third, and his wife runs in, and the sheer panic about someone seeing that. Whereas now, the beauty of it is actually everyone's sort of human. Kids do run
Hmm.
in, wives do ask a question, someone might bring you a cup of tea, and we don't hide that anymore. And what I found quite nice, you embrace it. And I reflect on the fact that actually, but for the pandemic and subsequent changes in behavior, I doubt any of my colleagues would ever have seen my kids, or known that like I had a personality outside the work construct, and that is in a way quite liberating, and I think brings people close together to see that actually that person is human, has got other things going on, and yeah, that was a nice moment. So thank you.
No, and I'm with you, but the only thing I'll say, it's not to be, I don't want to be a wet blanket on everything you just said because I fundamentally agree, but I'm noticing actually right now, and this is just an anecdote, I could be wrong, but I think people are feeling more awkward again, um, letting people into the fact that they're working remotely because we're now in a structured hybrid environment
Well,
where
this is
there's an expectation to be in the office, right? And I think that in a lot of companies the company's trying to boil the frog a bit and get everybody to come in, from 2 days to 4 days and maybe even hopefully five. And I notice a level of stress that people feel about what we just experienced that wasn't there in 2021 or 2022. And I
there's
think that's
also now, to
unfortunate.
your point, it's a bit like, well, why is Dave at home? Why does he get to see his kid? Like, why have I come into the office? Like,
Hmm.
and that's what I think companies struggle with is if you mandate things. We've been through a period where, to your point earlier, we're still sort of recovering from, and being forced into something feels a bit much. And some people were hired remote first, yeah, during this whole period, or they were hired with flexibility. So trying to put everything back to how it was is difficult. It can be financial. You may have a 7 year, 10 year lease with no breaks, and you want to maximize the value of that office. You can't get rid of it. Maybe because you believe you work better, in person, or you're just old school and believe you can't work at home. I think now managing your colleagues and your company stakeholders into a system that can be uh, adhered to, I think one of the biggest challenges that I see, I'm sure you're closer to that as well. And what you're seeing is what is that balance? And someone mandating 5 days, someone being completely flexible. If you're too flexible, then you get days where there's one person in the office. Well, what does that bring? What's your advice then? If you're a company,
Well,
what's the way forward?
here's the thing I'm thinking about right now a lot. So, a conversation started on LinkedIn the other day. A colleague and friend of mine, Steve Jeans, who's one of the co-founders of Dasana, made a post about, you know, if an employer wants you to commute into the office like 3 or 4 or 5 days a week, should they actually be paying you to do it? Um, right? And of course, right now we're in a dynamic where it's the inverse. It's like people are actually willing to take a pay reduction to be able to do that, which shows how much they value it. But at what point might the pendulum swing the other way? And so here's the thing I'm thinking. Uh, his colleague, Michael Cockburn, Coburn, actually, sorry, I believe is the way to pronounce it, made the comment that cloud computing disrupted the real estate industry. It's just that the pandemic accelerated that
Mm.
disruption. And I do agree with that statement. But the thing that's different about most of the cloud computing world, or at least that example, is that there's um, there's not a direct relationship in the context of the workplace's evolution between those that are changing it, i.e., Dasana would be a good example, um, and the actual customer, which are people, employees, like just people who need to work somewhere. It's they have to sell to the employer, and the employer is still living in a world where it's pretty binary. It's like we will let you come into our workplace or you work at home, but like let's look at the numbers. Like there's something like 170 million people in the United States working. I think something like 30% of days are work from home days. And this is Nick Bloom data, by the way, right now. Um, of those work from home days, right now, roughly 90% of those days are actually from the home, and 10% of them are not from the home, which means roughly 5 million people on a day-to-day basis are actually working near their homes or from a third party space that's not a central or company office. This to me is the biggest social movement that still has a ton of friction, which, whether we call it working near home or simply unbundling people from a centralized method of working and leaving their home, there are many, many more people who want those kinds of solutions than are actually getting them. And my belief around that is that most employees are not going to pay the money and deal with the logistical challenges of finding third-party workspaces to work from that are not their company's office. They'd actually rather just work at home in those instances. But it doesn't really work for a lot of people. For example, I work a lot of days from home, and my wife and I have been looking at each other being like, this isn't working. Like we need more separation from each other. But I don't want to go back and live in Toronto and work in a central office. So what I'm going to end up doing is paying more for co-working space in town where I live, right? But in an ideal world, my employer would be empowering me by paying for that, dealing with the logistics around that, and making that part of my employee experience, right? And so, like, there's just so much like left to go. And I don't know. The other thing too is that by this dynamic existing where companies have a binary mindset, you either work at my office or you work at home, it's actually slowing and stalling out the progression of the serviced workplace world. Like I hope we eventually get a better name for it than either flex space or space as a
Service
service.
offices,
Like
yeah.
it's just like I hope we eventually get somewhere better. But these companies can't grow to the same extent because there isn't actually enough demand. The demand is being stalled out by employers not embracing a more nuanced mindset around how to enable the employee experience. So my
What's
hope is that starts to get accelerated more in the next decade.
on that? What's your take? Because for me, the challenge, I work from home 3 days a week. We were 4 days, and we decided to up it, but one more just to have some more intentionality around meetings and making sure there's good team cohesion. The challenge for me isn't going to the office; it's leaving the front door. And it's like, if I leave the front door, how much more effort, if I get a good podcast on it, or I can use my time in a constructive manner, I worry less whether I'm going to a local co-working space versus an office. In your mind, is that the same? Or actually, is there a big distinction? Is it not? You mentioned you're going to co-working space. Obviously, where you are now geographically is different. But if you were, let's say, living in the suburbs of Toronto, and there was co-working that was 5 minutes away, and the CBD being 15, does that affect your mindset?
Yeah, well, this is where things just get so nuanced because it's not even just about location friction. It can be about the nature of the work that you're doing that day, and it could also be even be about the culture that you exist within. So let's look at a couple of those nuances. I was speaking with a colleague of mine yesterday who's helping me with a big client assignment that we're working on, and she had been working from 5:30 in the morning that day and it was like 8 o'clock at night. And she was doing that from home. And she remarked that there was no way she would ever be able to get the work done that she was doing from the office. She would have been distracted a million times and it would have never worked. Right. Now, I don't know whether she prefers to be at home. Maybe she prefers to work near home. And that's not an option for her right now, right? Because for various reasons, there's either not good environments to do it from, that she might even pay for herself, and or she doesn't have an employer that's empowering her, right? But what she needs actually is a workspace, irrespective of whether it's home or somewhere else, where those distractions are not there, right? And she might actually want to work in some form of open environment, but maybe more like the internet cafe, right? Where there's a social contract of not being
Yeah.
interrupted. But her mental health might be better supported by not being isolated in her home, but she doesn't have that option, right? For various reasons. But the work at hand necessitates more of a remote, not collaborating, interacting with colleagues, maybe in the way that you just described with your 2 days a week in the office, right? So that's one example. Another might be someone might actually want to work out of their home, but they don't want to go to the corporate office because the culture's toxic. They experience microaggressions or whatever the case may be, and they want to be in a third party space, but they'd prefer not to go to that office if they could avoid it, right? So, and I'm sure that someone else could sit on this call with us and come up with 20 other ones, right? So I think that the bottom line is clearly we need corporate offices still. There's less space needed and different ways of activating it, but there's this like gaping void in the middle, which is sort of an unbundling of the central office model, right? And the larger the team gets, the larger the size of the organization, the more complex and different individual requirements for people become, right? And right now, I just don't think that we're doing a very good job
Is that
of.
scalable though? Like if you've got a big business and you start compounding those nuanced requirements across 10, 15, 20, 35, how do you run a business with so much consideration for everyone's individual needs? Is that realistic? Or is it
Well,
idealistic and we should work towards that sort of goal?
Well, I think that a lot of these employee experience software companies that are popping up, whether it's like Cafe or Flexi AI that I work with, like companies are not really focused on the facilitation of a third party space, but are more focused on like nudging behavior, facilitating like interaction, all the different employee experience stuff that can come through those like technology, being a partner in that. I think is going to be big to the future. It'll ensure actually, even if we go into the central office, that we're meeting up with the people that we intend to, right? It's easier to meet up with the people at a startup company that you want to meet up with because there's 20 people in the company in total or 50 people in the company in total. But when you go into the Apple campus and you're trying to meet up with Sally, like maybe you will, maybe you won't, right? Like so I think like a big part of it is actually how that technology can become a partner in the facilitation of whatever the outcome is, whether the people need to congregate and meet together or whether or not we start to get a better understanding of the different personas that people have and the type of workplace offerings that need to be there, whether they be at someone's home, in between, or at an office. But then Fedora, my dog's now barking at me.
Everyone now.
Yeah, here. Oh, I don't know. Does this go on video or no?
Uh,
Well, you can meet her either way.
oh,
There she
hello.
is.
Lovely
Yeah,
pug.
yeah.
Old.
I don't know for sure we adopted her. She's around 4. She's
Very
good. Okay,
cute.
leave me alone. Um, so, but then the other thing is that like a company on its own can't scale this. They're not in this business. Like like they need like partners like Basana to help them not just here's the space, but help them actually build that roadmap for the employee experience and iterate and evolve and change it as they get more information about, is this working well for our employee population or these teams or those teams. So I think it is all scalable. It's just that and I don't want to get too focused on technology because it's not like technology is some magic bullet, but it's the interconnection between technology that's not existed to nudge the right behaviors and smart people that are running those businesses that can actually be a partner to employers to help them execute.
So it's a combination of the right real estate, the right C-suite, the right systems, and the right mindset of the employers.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
they're
and I
all,
think that yeah, and the younger companies are going to get this faster. Like the Flex Index is another great resource that I use a lot, and the younger the organization, the more flexible their policies are, right? Like if the company was founded after 2011, I think it's a huge number. It's like 90% plus. I forget the exact number. Don't have any mandate, right? So their mindset is going to be better served to embrace the technology and consultation opportunities that are growing, right? To hopefully, really make work a consumer product, right? Like hopefully it becomes more of a consumer product over time. Because as I mentioned, I think that there's this interesting friction in real estate where the technology and service providers that are out there don't actually have a direct connection to the actual customer, which is us. We are the customer.
it feels like from what you're saying, and again, I'm not putting words, this is a question and it's not leading, is the landlords are the one who like have the most to lose. I'm trying to think of what was traditional real estate, why people bought a building 10, 15 years ago. They might have bought it with the assumption that they'd get 10-year leases, nice uplifts, a few breaks, you can control the revenue. No need to massively do much, capex into the buildings. The tenant will put them out, and suddenly now they're in a world where, from what we've just discussed, the fundamentals have shifted so much that it's quite hard for them to compete in this market. If you're a landlord right now, and let's say you're not a big institutional landlord, and this is part of just maybe part of your portfolio, how are you expected to operate in the space where there's so much fluidity, where there's so much capex required to make these buildings to a certain standard that facilitates these cultures, where you have to deal with the moving away from secure income to sort of this sort of flexible unknowns. Like, what would you tell me as a landlord? Like, what should I be doing to reduce my risk and maximize my upside and stay relevant, and maximize my assets potential going forward? And of course, I know it's asset specific, it's location specific, like just conceptually speaking.
Well, I mean, I think we can look at the poker example in an interesting way, right? Like let's just take the European Poker Tour or the World Poker Tour as an example, right? They are using the real estate of a casino or a hotel to basically bring their service offering to life, right? And so I think that if a landlord has the right real estate, they should still theoretically be able to monetize that real estate. It's just, I think that those that are servicing that real estate to actually match the desires of the customers that it's intended for are going to be the ones that actually sustain it, like in the first place, right? Like who knows how well some of these like hotels and casinos would continue to do with the evolution of, like, let's say online gaming, if there weren't really good service providers that were actually online companies, right? Like pokerstars.com actually purchased the European Poker Tour, right? So there's this direct interconnection between
Mm.
the digital world and the physical world that's actually being led by the digital world, right? They're taking their much bigger customer base from online and bringing it into various physical locations around the world and activating it and making money from it. So like that is a dynamic that I think will in some way, shape, or form perpetuate. And you have to ask yourself, like, what would have happened if it just bifurcated and people were like, well, we're never going to play poker in person ever again. Online's way better. Some of these casinos or gaming, like, these casinos would have suffered. But we know that that's not the case. We know that people like to play blackjack at the table or whatever. It's just that this world evolved and it's become better for the customer, right? And so I think the same thing is true. Like, the Bellagio Hotel in Vegas is still a great piece of real estate, right? It's just that it's maybe functioning differently than it did before. And this is where the tension lies, though. The real estate world needs more on-demand service space. Like the ratios are off, right? Between, like, when we maybe they're not really off today, but they're like, if they don't start to continue to shift towards like service and on demand and like the, let's call it like the corporate freelancer persona that's kind of evolving. If it doesn't start shifting, well, then the actual physicality of that real estate won't be fit for purpose, right? Like no one wants to walk into an old IBM floor to like co-work or do something cool. Like it has to be a different physical space to meet that need. But then from there, I think it'll be the same dynamic where it's like, you make your clip and return off the real estate, and those that service it come in and actually probably experience a larger upside. The only question is like how much of that will be landlords getting into this business themselves and experiencing the benefit of that upside, right? Because the internet, like when you look at the evolution of the internet, the telecom companies laid the physical infrastructure. They're not the ones that got
Mm.
rich. Like everyone who's made money off the service layer of the internet is the one who got rich, right? It's going to be a similar dynamic in the real estate industry. It's just I think there actually is a unique opportunity for the ownership side to get involved, but the friction points are like the capital outlay up front, because there's just like it's a huge risk, right? And then capital markets, the way that the assets are valued and financed, prohibit a lot of that. But it's not like new. The hotel sector's done it. There's a symbiotic relationship between hotel operators and owners of that real estate. But the truth, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know the answer. I don't know the answer, but I don't think that this is new. I think we can look at like gaming and see some parallels, and I think that we can look at the hotel industry and see some parallels. The difference here, though, is that like nobody wants this shit to change. Everybody would ideally like to just continue on business as usual, 10, 15-year leases, companies also actually don't really want to expend the mental energy, a lot of them, to figure out how to offer the workplace as a service to their employees in a far different way too, right? It's really complicated, and they'd rather just be able to serve it up the way they have too, right? So
In
there's
in
just, yeah.
in your home territory or things you're familiar, is there a particular building or company doing this what we described? And you can say this is more of this, please. These guys, they're getting it, or isn't nothing yet there that seems to have created a framework that can be replicated.
To me, the best example that, and I have not seen it, is like Poker Stars. Like that is what I hope the future is, right? Like when I log into Poker Stars, I get to play online. They actually help me qualify for tournaments that I can go play in person, where I can win my hotel accommodation and the events and everything. And then they bring me out there and I get to be in person for these moments that matter in that context. Now, I don't want to be like too romantic and say that the same exact dynamic could take place for work, but I can't actually point to anyone who has created that frictionless experience that I got when I was playing poker, that blended me between online and in person. Like, fuck, man. Someone can solve that in that context. The opportunity is so much bigger than online gaming. It's not even funny. Like, everybody works. You know what I mean? Not everybody gambles, but everybody works.
We haven't had a chance to talk about AI today and what that means to work, because everyone works. So we'll be working in a few years' time. Who knows? I'm just very conscious of time, and you've got a lot going on. I'll ask you one more question, then you can go back to your lovely family and dog and beautiful scenic views. What are you most excited about for next year? What are you, as we draw to an end? You mentioned been a year of change and flux. What's exciting you for next year?
Figuring out what I'm going to do next.
Watch the
I'm going
space.
to, well, it's still in the area of the workplace, in one way or another. I just don't know exactly what. And I'm trying to look at it positively, because honestly, some days I'm like, I'm exhausted by it. But it is an exciting opportunity. I think it's important, like, to call out, like, there's a lot of people that are very fatigued right now. This is a challenging moment in the world. We got all kinds of existential problems and wars and shit going on, and all on top of that, there's a lot of like trying to put us back into 2019 from a work perspective, and I think we're all exhausted on one level or another. But it is also equally exciting, and I'm working very hard inside myself to focus more on the fact that it is exciting, and I know that in 2024 I'll figure out something interesting and cool to do. So
That's
that's
awesome.
what I'm excited. Yeah.
I look forward to seeing you in one of your nice vlogs or video posts, whatever they're called on LinkedIn. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for helping us understand the man behind the man. Really helps. And it's nice because particularly in real estate, I think there's this assumption that everyone sort of just comes from a certain background and goes into it. And actually, a lot of people meander their way into it. And usually what happens is when you've come from into a particularly established industry with a varied background, it allows you to make changes. So clearly, everything even what brought you here is what's giving you the energy and the vision to change things. So that's very exciting. So thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. You took me on a journey that I wouldn't have expected. So thanks.
Thank you for listening to Pixel Chasing, and well done for making it right to the end. If you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to share with others who you think may also enjoy it. And to be kept up to date with all they're up to here, you can always follow us on the usual channels. On Twitter, we are @PixelChasing. On Instagram, we are @PixelChasing. And if you want to join our newsletter to be kept up to date with all future episodes, you can join that on our website, which is pixelchasing.com. Thank you.